welcome. Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor K.Paul, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University. Dear students of Semester 2, Unit 2 of CC8. So good morning and welcome to my class. So today I am going to discuss literature and psychoanalysis. Since the origins of psychoanalysis, the field has displayed a powerful set of connections to literature, one that might even be called natural fascination. Literary criticism, primarily in its academic form, has been the major mediator between the two disciplines. The three domains of psychoanalysis, literature and literary criticism or literary theory, intertwine and seek to use each other in distinctive ways. Psychoanalysis has occasionally sought to explain literature, but far more often uses literature as a source or exemplar for psychoanalytic conceptions themselves. Literary criticism has sought to use psychoanalytic theory to explain literature, and even literature itself has sometimes sought to exploit psychoanalysis for creative purposes. The relation of these three domains manifests particular predilections. For example, the fascination of literary critics with psychoanalytic theory from Sigmund Freud to Jacques Lacan has been far greater than the interests of historians in the same conceptions, despite the fact that such theories can be easily applied to historical phenomena as to literary ones. The field of psychohistory remains relatively marginal in American and European universities, while psychoanalytic concepts permeate most branches of literary studies. Within literature departments, interest in psychoanalytic theory eclipses attention, when there is any at all, to other systems of psychology like behaviorism or neurological, biological approaches. Yet this does not echo the balance of forces in the same universities' psychology departments, where the situation is almost opposite. Affinities between literature and psychoanalysis are both cultural and structural. Culturally, it is not a coincidence that the two greatest literary dissections of the modern soul, James Joyce's Ulysses and Marcel Proust's A la Recherche du Temps Perdu, appeared around the same time as Freud's foundational interpretation of dreams. The temporal connection is less a question of influence than of participation in a common culture. Structurally, psychoanalysis elicits and tells stories. Like most of literature, it is structured around narratives. Talk therapy is necessarily mediated by language. Psychoanalysis explores the complexities of the human soul, a major preoccupation of literature, already true for Freud. The structural affinity was depended by Jung, whose system of archetypes is linked both to the creative imagination and to myths, using the universality of myths to demonstrate the collective unconscious. Lacan continues the trend with the notion that the unconscious is organized on the principles of human language, as these were conceptualized by the structural linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jacobson. Language is transformed by Lacan from a mediator between the unconscious and the therapeutic realm to something that defines the unconscious itself. Freud turned to literature both for evidence of his mappings of the unconscious and to explain what he found there. The Oedipus story, which reached Freud through the literary medium of Sophocles' tragedy to become the Oedipus complex, is the best known example of this phenomena. Bruno uh, uh, Bruno Bettelheim's classic The Uses of Enchantment similarly exploited the world of fairy tales to illuminate child psychology and vice versa. More recently, in the Jungian school, Helen M. Luke in her Dark Wood to White Rose uses Gathe's Divine Comedy for evidentiary, explanatory, and psychotherapeutic purposes. Lacan himself turned his attention to Shakespeare and Edgar Allan Poe. A legion of writers from the therapeutic community has explored the psychoanalytic basis of fairy tales, popular literature, and even the texts of the Bible. Such connections are possible because psychoanalytic theory has always been literature and the arts generally as owing much of their appeal to their ability to express unconscious content in masked form, as well as their ability to act as vehicles of fantasy, and in Freud's case, particularly as socially acceptable sublimations of erotic drive. The greatest influence of psychoanalysis on literary production has probably been to add legitimacy to the already existing trends towards a greater psychological introspection and towards more prominent and franker discussions of sexuality. Though Freud was never an exponent of sexual freedom, merely arguing that his own culture took sexual repression too far. Wider circles have treated him as a liberator of sexual expression, whether to blame him or to laud him for this. Would we have had Henry Miller without Freud? Between the world wars in the 20th century, the politico-artistic school of surrealism, championed by psychoanalysis as an overture to new aesthetic domains. This impact has probably been clearest and longest in surrealist visual arts, but the surrealist literary school developed the practice of automatic writing as a way of tapping into the unconscious. All this under the influence of the Freudian revolution in psychology. The closest connection between literature and psychoanalysis has always been articulated by the academic field of literary criticism or literary theory. In the United States, where the acceptance of Freud was earlier and greater than in Europe, Friedrich C. Kruse, Norman Holland, and Harold Bloom were among the most visible members of a large school of large school of literary criticism that sought to apply Freudian concepts to the explication of literary texts. Crews and Holland later shifted positions. Crews to a more critical view of Freud, and Holland more recently to an interest in cognitive psychology and neurobiology. Following the fashion for French theory, Jacques Lacan became increasingly prominent, contributing, for example, to a fascination with the idea of desire as fundamental to the nature of literary texts. The Slovenian Slavoj Zizek, who uses Lacan along with the Marxist theory in his literary and cultural analysis, has become increasingly influential in Europe and America, while feminist literary critics have challenged specific conclusions of psychoanalytical schools from Freud to Lacan. They have generally done so more in an attempt to redefine and recuperate the psychoanalytic universe than to set it aside. Perhaps most typical of the affinities between literature, literary criticism, and psychoanalysis has been the fact that some figures have been able to master all three. The Protean writer Julia Kristeva, for example, is at once a trained psychoanalyst, a well-known literary critic whose writings use both literature and psychoanalysis to deepen the understanding of each, and a successful author of imaginative fiction. Thus, while in the mass media interest is increasingly turning to drug therapies and neurobiological explanations of behavior, elite culture manifests a continuing interpenetration of the worlds of psychoanalysts, analysis, and literature. The case of Norman Holland, though it may portend future trends, remains typical. Psychoanalytic literary criticism is literary criticism or literary theory which in method, concept, or form is influenced by the tradition of psychoanalysis begun by Sigmund Freud. Psychoanalytic reading has been practiced since the early developments of psychoanalysis itself, and has developed into a heterogeneous interpretive tradition. As Celine Suprinant writes, psychoanalytic literary criticism does not constitute a unified field. However, all variants endorse at least to certain degree the idea that literature is fundamentally entwined with the psyche. The object of psychoanalytic literary criticism at its very simplest can be the psychoanalysis of the author or of a particularly interesting character in a given work. The criticism is similar to psychoanalysis itself, closely following the analytic interpretive process discussed in Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams and other works. Critics may view the fictional characters as psychological case studies attempting to identify such Freudian concepts as the Oedipus complex. Freudian slips, id, ego, and superego, and so on, and demonstrative how they influence the thoughts and behaviors of fictional characters. However, more complex variations of psychoanalytic criticism are possible. The concepts of psychoanalysis can be deployed with reference to the narrative or poetic structure itself without requiring access to the authorial psyche. An interpretation motivated by French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan's remark that the unconscious is structured like a language, or the founding texts of psychoanalysis may themselves be treated as literature, and reread for the light cast by their formal qualities, by their formal qualities. On their theoretical content. Freud's texts frequently resemble detective stories or the archaeological narratives of which he was so fond. Like all forms of literary criticism, psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic criticism can yield useful clues to the sometimes baffling symbols, actions, and settings in a literary work. However, like all forms of literary criticism, it has its limits. For one thing, some critics rely on psychocriticism as a one-size-fits-all approach, when other literary scholars argue that no one approach can adequately illuminate or interpret a complex work of art. As Guerin et al. Put it in a handbook of critical approaches to literature. The danger is that the serious student may become theory reading, forgetting that Freud's is not the only approach to literary criticism. To see a great work of fiction or a great poem primarily as a psychological case study is often to miss its wider significance and perhaps even the essential aesthetic experience it should provide. Freud wrote several important essays on literature, which he used to explore the psyche of authors and characters, to explain narrative mysteries, and to develop new concepts in psychoanalysis. For instance, delusion and dream in Jensen's Gradiva, and his influential readings of the Oedipus myth, and Shakespeare's Hamlet in the interpretation of dreams. The criticism has been made, however, that in his and his early followers' studies, what calls for elucidation are not the artistic and literary works themselves, but rather the psychopathology and biography of the artist, writer, or fictional characters. Thus, many psychoanalysts among Freud's earliest adherents did not resist the temptation to psychoanalyze poets and painters, sometimes to Freud's chagrin. Later, analysts would conclude that clearly one cannot psychoanalyze a writer from his text, one can only appropriate him. Early psychoanalytic literary criticism would often treat the text as if it were a kind of dream. This means that the text represses its real or latent content behind obvious manifest content. The process of changing from latent to manifest content is known as the dream work and involves operations of concentration and displacement. The critic analyzes the language and symbolism of a text to reverse the process of the dream work, and arrive at the underlying latent thoughts. The danger is that such criticism tends to be reductive, explaining away the ambiguities of works of literature by reference to established psychoanalytic doctrine, and very little of this work retains much influence today. Later readers such as Carl Jung and another of Freud's disciples, Karen Horney, broke with Freud, and their work, especially Jung's, led to other rich branches of psychoanalytic criticism. Horney's to feminist approaches, including Womb, Envy, and Jung's to the study of archetypes and collective unconscious. Jung's work in particular was influential as combined with the work of anthropologists such as Claude Lévi-Strauss and Joseph Campbell. It led to the entire fields of mythocriticism and archetype analysis. Northrop Frye considered that the literary critic finds Freud most suggestive for the theory of comedy and Jung for the theory of romance. Wow writes, the development of psychoanalytic approaches to literature proceeds from the shift of emphasis from content to the fabric of artistic and literary works. Thus, for example, Hayden White has explored how Freud's descriptions tally with 19th century theories of tropes, which his work somehow reinvents. Especially influential here has been the work of Jacques Lacan, an avid reader of literature who used literary examples as illustrations of important concepts in his work. For instance, Lacan argued with Jacques Derrida over the interpretation of Edgar Allan Poe's The Purloined Letter. Lacan's theories have encouraged a criticism which focuses not on the author but on the linguistic processes of the text. Within this Lacanian emphasis, Freud's theories become a place from which to raise questions of interpretations, rhetoric, style, and figuration. However, Lacanian scholars have noted that Lacan himself was not interested in literary criticism per se, but in how literature might illustrate a psychoanalytic method or concept. So this way, dear students, I have completed my lecture for today. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.